There are moments in television history that don't just make headlines, they rewrite them. Moments where a single broadcast, a single sketch, a single poorly timed joke becomes the crack in the foundation of something that once seemed utterly unshakable. For the Benny Hill Show, that moment came quietly, almost without warning, tucked inside what looked like just another evening of laughter and chaos. Nobody in the studio that night could have predicted that what they were filming would one day be remembered not as comedy gold, but as the beginning of the end. For more than 3 decades, Benny Hill had been one of the most recognizable faces on British television. His name was synonymous with a particular kind of humor, loud, physical, unapologetically cheeky, and absolutely irresistible to millions of viewers who tuned in week after week to watch him stumble, chase, and mug his way through one outrageous sketch after another. The show had survived network changes, shifting television landscapes, and the natural evolution of British culture. It had crossed oceans, conquered American living rooms, and turned a working-class boy from Southampton into a global comedic institution. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. The story of how the Benny Hill Show went from broadcasting in over 140 countries to being quietly pulled off the air is not a simple one. It involves cultural shifts, mounting criticism, financial pressures, and one particularly controversial sketch that crystallized every complaint critics had ever leveled at the program. To truly understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the man himself, and back to the world that both created him and eventually grew tired of him. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 21, 1924, in Southampton, Hampshire, to a family with an unexpectedly rich connection to performance. His grandfather, Henry Hill, had been a circus clown, a fact that takes on an almost poetic significance when you consider the kind of comedy Benny Hill would go on to create. His father, Alfred Hill Sr., ran a surgical appliance shop, and his mother Helen kept the household together with the kind of quiet resilience common to working-class English families of that era. Young Alfred was not, by any outward measure, destined for stardom. He attended Taunton School in Southampton, and spent his teenage years cycling through a remarkable variety of odd jobs, working at Woolworths, delivering milk, operating a bridge, driving lorries, and even drumming in local bands. What these jobs lacked in glamour, they made up for in character, and Benny Hill was nothing if not a student of character. Every milkman route, every warehouse shift, every awkward encounter with an impatient customer was quietly filed away in the mental archive of a young man who was paying close attention to the absurdity of everyday life. His first real taste of the entertainment world came when he secured a position as an assistant stage manager with a touring revue. It was backstage work, unglamorous and largely invisible, but it placed him at the heart of live performance and taught him lessons about timing, stagecraft, and the delicate machinery of making an audience laugh. Those lessons would prove invaluable. When World War II arrived, Hill was called up for military service in 1942. He trained as a mechanic with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers and was eventually deployed to Normandy in September 1944, arriving in the thick of one of the most consequential military campaigns in modern history. He served as a truck driver and searchlight operator, roles that placed him in genuine danger. But it was his transfer to the Combined Services Entertainment Division before the war's end that would prove most formative. The CSE existed to boost morale among Allied troops through performance, and it was here that Hill discovered he could make people laugh under almost any circumstances. Performing for battle-weary soldiers in makeshift venues, with no fancy sets and no safety net, forced him to sharpen his timing and develop the kind of instinctive connection with an audience that cannot be taught in any classroom. He returned from the war with a stage name borrowed from his idol, the American comedian Jack Benny, whose impeccable deadpan delivery Hill greatly admired, and a burning ambition to make his mark in show business. Benny Hill's ascent through the entertainment world was neither swift nor smooth. His early radio appearances were inconsistent, his stage work received mixed reviews, and the path to lasting recognition was littered with frustrations and setbacks. But Hill was nothing if not persistent, and when television arrived as a cultural force in the early 1950s, he recognized it as the medium that suited him best. On January 15, 1955, The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC, and British television was never quite the same again. The format drew heavily from the tradition of British music hall entertainment: rapid sketch changes, crowd-pleasing physical comedy, broad characters, and a relentless energy that kept audiences from ever settling too comfortably into their seats. Hill combined live stage segments with pre-filmed material, a creative choice that gave him far more flexibility than most television comedians enjoyed at the time. His humor was built on slapstick, double entendres, sharp parody, and visual gags that could land without a word of dialogue. A rotating ensemble of talented performers helped bring his sketches to life during the BBC years. Patricia Hayes, Jeremy Hawke, Ronnie Brody, and co-writer Dave Freeman were among his most important early collaborators. Freeman in particular played a significant role in shaping the show's material throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, but it was Jackie Wright, a diminutive, bald-headed actor with an impossibly straight face, who became perhaps the most beloved supporting presence. Wright's specialty was absorbing Hill's infamous head-slapping routines with the stoic patience of a man who had long since made his peace with the indignities of slapstick, and audiences adored him for it. Hill briefly experimented with ATV between 1957 and 1960 and again in 1967, but the most transformative moment in the show's history came in 1969 when it moved permanently to Thames Television. The shift changed everything. Thames also gave the show the platform it needed to reach the wider world. Syndicated across more than 140 countries, The Benny Hill Show introduced global audiences to a very particular brand of British humor. In the United States especially, the show became a genuine phenomenon, earning Emmy Award nominations for Outstanding Variety in both 1980 and 1981. Hill received the prestigious Rose d'Or in 1984, and in 1972, he had already taken home the BAFTA Television Award for Best Writer, recognizing the craft and intelligence lurking beneath the custard pies and sped-up chase sequences. The show's most iconic element was arguably its closing chase, a frenetic madcap sequence in which Hill and an assorted cast of policemen, grandmothers, vicars, and scantily clad women careen through various locations at impossible speed, filmed using the undercranking technique that made every stumble and pratfall look gloriously absurd. Set to the irresistible bounce of boots, Randolph's, yakety sax, so thoroughly associated with Hill that it came to be known simply as the Benny Hill theme, these chases became the show's signature, the moment viewers waited for, the punctuation mark at the end of an hour of carefully constructed chaos. As the show moved into the 1980s, a new element was introduced that would both extend its appeal and accelerate its downfall. Hill's Angels, a troupe of attractive young women who appeared in choreographed routines and comedic sketches, became a central feature of the program. Their presence undeniably added energy and visual spectacle to the show, and several of the Angels, including Sue Upton and a young Jane Leeves who would later find international fame on Frasier, became genuinely beloved figures in their own right. But the Angels also gave critics something concrete to point at. For years, those who found Hill's humor uncomfortable had struggled to articulate exactly what bothered them. The show was popular, the laughter was real, and Hill himself was clearly a talented performer and writer. But the Angels, and the way they were framed within the show's humor, crystallized a growing unease. Here were women whose primary function as far as the show's structure was concerned was to be chased, ogled, caught off guard, and made the punchline of jokes about their appearance. Hill played these scenarios for laughs, and audiences largely went along with it, but increasingly, not everyone was laughing. The cultural climate in Britain was shifting. The early 1980s had seen the emergence of what became known as alternative comedy, a new wave of comedians who self-consciously positioned themselves against the traditions of mainstream British comedy. These were performers who rejected working men's club humor, who found mother-in-law jokes and sexual innuendo lazy and regressive, and who believed that comedy had a responsibility not to punch down. Benny Hill, with his scantily clad angels and his relentless innuendo, became a convenient symbol of everything this new generation wanted to move away from. It was in this increasingly charged atmosphere that the show aired what many consider its most damaging moment. In the late 1980s, with public attitudes toward gender representation in media shifting more rapidly than Hill or Thames Television seemed to fully appreciate, a sketch went to air that stripped away whatever remaining goodwill the show's critics were still prepared to extend. The sketch was built around the framework of a beauty pageant, a format that was already beginning to attract significant cultural scrutiny in its own right. Hill played a leering host figure presiding over a procession of women who existed, as far as the sketch's logic was concerned, purely to be assessed, commented upon, and made the subject of crude, dismissive jokes. The humor was built on objectification, so blunt and unapologetic that it left very little room for charitable interpretation. There was no particular cleverness to the sketch, no satirical edge, no moment where the joke turned on itself. It was simply a long sequence of women being reduced to their physical attributes, while Hill's character, and by extension, the show, invited the audience to laugh along. Critics who had been circling the show for years found in this sketch the clearest possible articulation of their concerns. The beauty pageant sketch wasn't dramatically different from material the show had been producing for years, but the timing was catastrophic. British television in the late 1980s was already moving decisively away from this kind of humor, and the sketch landed like a provocation, as if the show was deliberately refusing to acknowledge that the world had changed around it. The backlash was swift and loud. The most vocal and high-profile critic to emerge from this period was Ben Elton, a comedian and writer who had become one of the most prominent figures of the alternative comedy movement. Elton had already made it clear that he considered shows like The Benny Hill Show to be not merely unfunny, but actively harmful. In January 1987, in an interview published in Q magazine, and through his appearances on Saturday Live, Elton made his case with characteristic bluntness, accusing the show of perpetuating a culture in which women were objectified and demeaned, and suggesting that the values embedded in Hill's comedy contributed to an environment in which women felt unsafe. These were serious allegations, and they were not universally welcomed. Defenders of the show argued that Elton was engaging in exactly the kind of humorless political grandstanding that the alternative comedy movement was sometimes accused of. A writer in The Independent compared the pile-on to watching an elderly relative being attacked, unfairly acknowledging that the show might be dated while rejecting the notion that dated humor constituted genuine harm. Others pointed out the logical difficulties of attributing complex social problems to a television comedy, and suggested that Elton's argument said more about his own political commitments than about any real-world impact of Hill's jokes. Even Elton himself would later seem to acknowledge the limitations of his position. When he appeared as a caricature of himself in a sketch on Harry Enfield, You Chums playing Benny Elton, a pompous enforcer of political correctness who ends up being chased by angry women to the tune of yakety sax. It was a self-aware acknowledgement that the debate had perhaps generated more heat than light. But the regulatory establishment was also paying attention. A spokesman for the Broadcasting Standards Council acknowledged publicly that perceptions of humor were changing, and that content which had once seemed merely cheeky was increasingly being viewed through a different lens. Whatever the merits of Elton's specific arguments, there was no denying that a significant portion of the television-watching public had stopped finding The Benny Hill Show funny and had started finding it uncomfortable. Behind the cultural controversy, a more straightforward set of pressures was also building. The Benny Hill Show had been spectacularly profitable throughout the 1970s, and into the early 1980s Hill had reportedly earned Thames Television some £26 million, largely through the show's extraordinary success in the American market. But the American appetite for the show was not infinite, and as the 1980s progressed, those syndication revenues began to decline. Domestically, The viewing figures told a similar story. From the peak of over 21 million viewers in 1971, the audience had shrunk considerably by the late 1980s. A program that had once been a near-universal shared experience for British television viewers had become something more niche, still watched, still appreciated by a loyal audience, but no longer the cultural event it once was. Meanwhile, the cost of production had not decreased. Each episode of the show was by the late 1980s reportedly costing around £450,000, a figure that represented extraordinary value when the show was pulling in tens of millions of viewers and generating substantial overseas income, but looked increasingly difficult to justify as both metrics declined. Thames Television was a commercial broadcaster, and the arithmetic had shifted in a direction that was uncomfortable for everyone involved. In late May 1989, Thames Television announced that the Benny Hill Show would not be renewed. Hill, who had been a cornerstone of the network's output for 21 years, was informed that the show was being cancelled. The official reasons cited were declining ratings and unsustainable production costs, and while both of these were genuine factors, they existed within the broader context of a cultural moment in which the show had come to represent something that a new generation of television executives and commissioners were no longer comfortable defending. Hill took the news with characteristic dignity, at least publicly. He continued to work on new projects, demonstrating the kind of stubborn professionalism that had defined his career from the very beginning. In 1991, he embarked on an ambitious venture called Benny Hill's World Tour, which was designed to take his comedy to the international audiences who still adored him. The project ran into difficulties, and Hill managed to complete only one special greetings from New York before his health prevented further production. That health was failing significantly. In the mid to late 1980s, Hill had begun to suffer from a range of serious medical issues. He experienced a mild heart attack on February 24, 1992, after which doctors strongly recommended bypass surgery. Hill refused. Diagnosed with kidney failure shortly afterward, he similarly declined dialysis treatment. He continued to live alone in his flat in Teddington, maintaining the quietly modest existence he had always preferred despite his wealth and fame. On the morning of April 20, 1992, Benny Hill died peacefully in his armchair, discovered 2 days later after friends and colleagues were unable to reach him by telephone. He was 68 years old. The cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis. In a piece of timing so perfectly ironic, it almost seems invented. A new contract offer from Central Independent Television arrived at his flat on the very day he died. He was buried at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton, near the city where he had been born nearly 7 decades earlier. His estate, valued at approximately £7.5 million, was left in a will written 30 years before his death primarily to his parents, who had predeceased him. The inheritance passed instead to his 7 nieces and nephews. The cancellation of the Benny Hill Show was, in many ways, a product of its precise historical moment. The late 1980s were a period of intense cultural renegotiation around gender, representation, and the responsibilities of mass media entertainment. The beauty pageant sketch and others like it became focal points for anxieties that were really about something much larger, about what it meant for comedy to be complicit in attitudes that caused real harm, and about whether laughter could ever be fully innocent. These are not simple questions, and they do not have simple answers. Hill himself was, by most accounts, a genuinely shy and private man